My name is James Young, and I'm the host of It's a New Day. Today's guest is Professor Klofas, and thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much. A pleasure to be here.
Let's get right into the dynamics of this.
Yeah. Well, we at RIT and at the Center for Public Safety Initiatives, we focus a lot on locally relevant research and on the Rochester community. And we've been looking for about 10 or 12 years now at crime issues. I'm in the Department of Criminal Justice there, and at social issues, population issues in the city of Rochester. Trying to help out with understanding crime and crime issues, and understanding changes in the population and their relationship to crime. So we really start lots of our conversations with understanding the dynamics of the population in the city, poverty issues, changes in movement in the population across the city. And Rochester, of course, is a city that has undergone a lot of changes over the years. Some significant changes in the way the economy has developed and run, and some significant changes in the population. And we now, with the 2010 census, have a population that has stayed above 200,000 and is in fact stabilized. It seemed to have been dropping faster than is true now, and so we've seen some stability in neighborhoods that had declining population, but we've also seen a persistent poverty problem, and as with the economic turndown that's occurred, which hasn't helped, even though the trend longer than that has shown some significant poverty problems in the community. And you mentioned the term crescent, which has been a term that has sort of made it into the sort of popular language in some way, and it probably is describes too many things, takes too much for granted in some ways. But it developed really out of an analysis of homicides more than anything else, and the sort of geographic concentration of homicides. But that map of homicides coincides roughly with the map of poverty in the city of Rochester, and a number of other sort of issues that are issues of transitional neighborhoods. So we really began by looking at poverty, and those areas around the city that have significant crime problems are the areas that really run from the sort of southwest of downtown around to the north and northeast of downtown. And that's areas where we've had both, they've been areas where there's been immigration into the city and change into the city, and movement of people often through those neighborhoods as people are very mobile. But those are the areas where we've seen concentrated poverty in the city.
Okay. I know that you brought some graphs to show us basically what you're talking about, the areas of poverty, the areas of crime, the homicides. But would you like to begin speaking about those?
Sure. The first of those that we want to talk about really is the one that I was really just describing to you, and that is really the concentration of poverty. But at the same time, as we talk about it with regard to the city, it's important to understand that that is a characteristic that is associated with the way the county has been laid out in many ways, the population in the county, where you have the highest concentrations of poverty in that area of the city we discussed, and the highest concentrations of more affluence outside of the city in the suburbs and suburban development. But that's a pattern that is true of urban areas across the state and really across the country. That the typical pattern in the United States, and it's not necessarily the same in some other countries, but the typical pattern in the United States has been that that there are urban areas near the center of downtowns frequently that become areas where the population is often in transition, moves through, but there are high concentrations of poverty. So across New York State, we see in Buffalo, you see the same situation, and if you go across the thruway, you'll see it in Rochester, and you'll see it in Syracuse, and you'll see it in the Albany, Schenectady area, just as you do in Rochester. So there's a dynamic here that is shared. There are certainly some unique features of the history of Rochester and the histories of the other communities that help define the nature of those problems. But we have a situation here of really poverty areas that have been pretty stable as poverty areas in cities that are surrounded by wealthier communities and wealthier suburbs. And that has been a dynamic that's grown increasingly sharp over the past couple of decades.
Okay. Let's first talk about the homicide rates here and how that looks and how these charts really bring this into focus.
Rochester has had a significant problem of violence for a long period of time. We saw increases of homicides in the early 1990s, which were the highest homicide years for the city of Rochester and for many cities across the country. And that seemed to have been associated with the emergence of crack cocaine, for example. But at that point in time, we had close to 70 homicides a year. With a population of just over 200,000, 70 homicides a year is a very high number. In the wake of that, we really settled down to around 50 homicides per year. We probably went through a 20-year period where we averaged 50 homicides per year. Now, if you think about that, we often translate those into rates of homicide per 100,000 population. So 50 homicides per year gives us a rate of about 25 per 100,000 population. If you were to look at New York City today, for example, New York City has a homicide rate of around 6 per 100,000. They've had higher rates, but they've dropped it significantly. Our homicide rate and our homicide numbers, last year we didn't have 50, we didn't meet our average, thankfully, but we had 40. And so far this year, and we're talking about this in almost the middle of December, we've had 29. So in the last couple of years at least, we've seen some significant declines, and we've seen even the year before the one we had 40 on, we saw the end of that year significant drop. So there's really reason to be optimistic about the decline in those homicides over the past couple of years. But even with that decline, it's hard to ignore the fact that Rochester has had a serious problem of violence for a significant period of time, and we don't come close to reaching those very low levels that we've seen in New York and some other cities around the country.
I know that you also have showing a chart that states that 54% of those homicides were disputes.
Yeah, we have studied closely, and we've worked with the criminal justice system and the Rochester Police Department, which has had real concerns, obviously, over this. And we've studied those homicides closely, and they really, the majority of homicides, over half, clearly are the result of arguments and disputes. There's another, probably 25% or so that are really connected to those disputes in some ways, in the sense that it may not be the two people engaged in the dispute who wind up killing one another, but someone is killed as a result of mistaken identity or a drive-by shooting in which someone is hit and there's the bottom of it is an argument or a dispute. So and even with regard to drugs, a lot of the homicides that are associated with drugs are really disputes, and they're arguments, between people who are armed and who feel, in many cases, the need to retaliate for some perceived wrong or some kind of wrong. So the biggest concentration of problems we have associated with homicide is really arguments and disputes, and the resolution of those with lethal violence rather than some other means, and that's been a persistent problem as we've looked at homicides over the years.
Okay. You have another chart that basically now shows several people on parole, probation, either coming out of jail, and what impresses me the most is when I look at all these dots that
Yeah.
are on that particular chart. What does that represent to a community when you have a community that has this many people somehow involved in law enforcement or criminal justice or the judicial system?
Yeah, you know, you mentioned that I have a lot of charts, and I have a lot of charts, and people will see a lot of charts. But I struggle with ways to really understand the information in those charts and to help other people understand the information in those charts. And when you look at the concentration of homicides that we talked about, the fact that we've had 50 homicides, those homicides are all occurring in a fairly small geography in the city of Rochester. They're in that area that you mentioned earlier as being described as the Crescent. And when you look closely at that set of neighborhoods, you see that there's a very high concentration of people who are under some form of correctional supervision in and from those neighborhoods. If you look at the probation population, there's about 6,500 people on probation in Monroe County, and the overwhelming majority of those will be in Rochester, and the overwhelming majority of those will be in the neighborhoods which we talk about. There are a significant number of people on parole. The Department of Corrections sends about 1,000 people a year back into this community, back into the city of Rochester. But it's a mistake to just leave it as saying they're all coming back to Rochester, because they're really coming back to a small number of neighborhoods, and those are the neighborhoods that have had a significant set of other issues to confront for a long period of time. So when you look at parole and probation and jail and imprisonment, you see there have been really significant effects on all of those in those neighborhoods. And the truth is, it's hard to separate out entirely the effects of crime and the effects of criminal justice at the same time. It's probably best thought of as something similar to medical treatments in some. That is, the illness certainly has important elements and affects you in sometimes very terrible ways, but the treatments can also have significant effects, and we see that both crime and criminal justice have had significant effects in many of these neighborhoods, and that's really the critical story. So if you look in some of the areas we're talking about, 1 out of 3 young men will be on probation, on parole, in jail, or have gone or in prison from that particular neighborhood.
So to bring this even closer to home, when we are stating, or when one reads that 1,000 people are coming back to Rochester to Monroe County, a vast majority of them are going into this Crescent area.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. And you know, if you look at the way statistics are kept, often they'll say, you know, how many murders Rochester has, or how many parolees are returning to Rochester. And in fact, all of these issues are issues that affect different neighborhoods in Rochester very differently. And there's much of the city doesn't experience any of these problems at a significant kind of level. But that also means that some parts of the city are dramatically affected by it. And it means that growing up in some neighborhoods will be very, very different than growing up in other neighborhoods, even within the city of Rochester, not just across the city in suburbs or across the metropolitan area, but within the city itself. There are very, very big differences in all of these kinds of issues.
And now let's talk about the impact that this is having. Once again, you have another chart that talks about or depicts of the women and children in these zip-coded areas in the Crescent area. But will you talk about that disparity, please?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the more significant findings, and it relates back to the fact that there are crime issues and there are criminal justice issues that we all ought to be concerned with. And one of the impacts of our heavy use of criminal justice and incarceration in particular has been one of the side effects of the way we've approached the crime problem with the heavy use of incarceration has been that young men from those neighborhoods are sent out to prison in large numbers and leave a hole in the community where you'd expect those young men to be found. So in some neighborhoods across the community, there are 1,000 or more missing young men, people you would expect to find in the census data, who may be 18 to 30 years old, for example. But there'll be 1,000 fewer of those. And what that means is that there is a significant gap. There are, in some cases, nearly a third of the young men that you would expect to find are not in the neighborhoods. It means that there are dramatically more young women than young men in those neighborhoods. And that has a dramatic effect on issues that we often think are dependent only on sort of individuals' decisions, concerned with teen pregnancy, for example, or either other issues relating to dating kinds of behavior. But there are factors about the structure of the community that weigh very heavily on those. So you have a great loss of young men. So in some of these neighborhoods, you have 120 or 130, in some cases even as high as 150 young women for every 100 young men that are in those neighborhoods, which really makes finding a mate, finding someone to settle down with and have a family with, and have a very different task in those kind of neighborhoods, and really sets up a whole series of problems associated with the search for that and teen pregnancy kind of problems, or older men preying on younger women, for example, because there are so few eligible mates around in many ways. So many of the problems that we have associated with the characteristics of neighborhoods or issues that are relevant to the changing nature of the city population are really also very heavily influenced by the structure there that is greatly influenced by the way we've handled other problems, including crime and criminal justice. So there are a lot of effects on gender behavior and dating behavior, and there are a lot of effects on supervision in those neighborhoods. The other impact, aside from the problems with the loss of young men in those neighborhoods, is that over time we've seen a growing disproportionality of the relationship between the number of children and the number of adults. We've seen significant increases in the number of children in those neighborhoods who now you would expect to see a corresponding sort of blip on the charts where their parents would be, people of 25 to 35 or 40 years old. But in fact, we see that dynamic changing in those neighborhoods, and we see increasing numbers of children and reducing numbers of adults to supervise those kinds of children. So the kinds of things that we have come to accept in crime and criminology about the characteristics of strong neighborhoods and the importance of strong neighborhoods to help fight crime and to help address other kinds of issues are the very characteristics that get weakened in these situations where you have fewer adults, you have a situation where the structure works against stable kinds of relationships, and you have large numbers of children who don't have the level of supervision that you might hope for the reason, or one of the reasons being that you simply don't have the adult presence that you would otherwise have.
Okay.
So these neighborhoods are the population in some ways may have stabilized a bit over the last census, but the dynamics of that population are of great concern, I think, and really say that there are issues to consider, not just the sort of individual decisions made by people, but really the structural circumstances, the shape and form of the neighborhoods in which people live.
So once again, to bring this into a content that people can understand. When we compare the Crescent area to, let's say, over on Park Avenue, we see so much of a disparity in the dynamics of a community. When we look at that particular community, the Park Avenue area, we will see the things in that community, like for instance, men of a certain age, they'll be in that community. We will see a stabilization of that community where businesses are there, where there's an activity of a real sense of community. Whereas when we look at the Crescent area, we see all of the missing ingredients to making a stable, making a community stable. Which now brings me into to ask you, how do we begin to start turning those dynamics around? What has to be done? Now we understand that we can't let crime run rampant and stop trying to protect the community there from further problems being generated there. But how do we begin to start getting into these communities, and how do we begin to start addressing this? How do we make that community recognize that there are some serious problems here?
Well, I mean, I think you ask a very important question, a question that indicates that we really need to begin to look at these things comprehensively to understand the changes that have occurred in these communities and continue to occur, and the importance of really bringing together a lot of resources and a lot of thinking to address them comprehensively, and not to think that if we just begin to address one issue, if we rely solely on a police presence, for example, that we're going to solve this, or if we rely solely on a sort of moral and religious argument about gender relations and sexual relations and stuff, that's going to solve these kinds of issues. I think there are a core set of concerns, but the solution to those is really going to require a set of broad thinking and really an effort to redevelop those communities, both economically and in terms of social issues and social concerns, to integrate people into those neighborhoods, to strengthen those underlying neighborhoods, and to really assist people in those neighborhoods with finding the kinds of solutions to their personal problems that everyone looks for: steady work, educational achievement. The level of education is critically important. The economy is changing very rapidly, and even with the loss of manufacturing jobs that we've seen in this community, we see a growing economy that is requiring much higher levels of education, much higher levels of sophistication, and we need to make sure that the community is really prepared to move fully into those kinds of jobs, which means higher education levels, higher concentrations really of people prepared to take on that economy.
We're dealing with generational problems. When you are born into an environment and you see your grandmother, your mother, your siblings on welfare, living in despair. Anyway, I've noticed that people begin to think that this is somehow normal. Well, it's normal to their sense of thinking, to their sense of living. How do we begin to get people, in particularly in the Crescent area, because I think that it has to start there. How do we get them to start seeing that there is hope? And then how do we get people outside of the Crescent area to start recognizing that this is still a part of Rochester, and we need to do something because this is a direct reflection of Rochester, and the city of Rochester is paying for this.
You know, as you pose those questions, I can't help but think that you probably have a different, maybe a better understanding of a lot of those issues than I have and many other people. So I'm equally interested in your view on that. But I think that you really do hit the important element it clearly is. And when you hear discussions, for example, of education, that wouldn't things be better if parents were more involved, or parents were reading more to their kids, you have to understand that the parents are the people who just came out of that very same school system. So that there's not going to be any easy solutions to this. It is, in fact, a multi-generational situation. And it's a situation that's occurring now in a very difficult economy, economy for people with any levels of education and background to really be very successful. So this is a very difficult set of circumstances, but it's going to require a combination, I think, of really people coming together and understanding the depth of these issues, and understanding the significance and seriousness of the problems that we face as a community at large, and that is really concentrated in certain parts of the community. I think it's going to take a focus on that, and with that, it's going to take a focus on real, clear kinds of policy decisions and clear kinds of governmental action and non-governmental action to address this. I think it will prove to be unsuccessful if we are not broadly thinking and thinking well about the scope of this kind of problems. The fact of this matter is this community has gone down a path of really economic and racial segregation for a long period of time. And when we talk about these problems and the overlap with poverty and the overlap with race, you can't miss the fact that, in fact, these are consequences of the way this community has developed. And now we have really, we are, as you suggest, really seeing the implications of that development across another generation, and perhaps another generation, that we need to be concerned with really interrupting that sequence.
Also, what I like to be able to emphasize as well is the direct correlation between education and crime. At one time, Rochester was a model for education for the entire country. But now, as we have seen the decline in education, we are seeing the increase in crime. And once again, according to the demographics and the charts that you have presented with us today, we are now actually able to see what is actually, we now have a snapshot of what is going on here. I know that you are involved in another organization. Would you like to talk about that is addressing these issues that you have out at the campus there?
Well, we're really working with the Center for Public Safety Initiatives, which is really trying to bring to bear to all these issues an analysis of information, analysis of data, and a sharing of that information with people. Because I think from where we stand and the kind of things that we can do, one of the things that I think we probably have good resources to do is pull that information together, try and bring some understanding, and hopefully find ways to communicate that with people such as yourself, who then really can take and really further the discussion of this kind of thing. But when we get back to the education and crime connection, there's another element to that equation that is worth really talking about, and that is when you look at the relationship between education and crime, or education and other kinds of problems, you see in the aggregate, in the combination, when you look across neighborhoods or schools or cities, you see a very strong relationship. But that relationship is not necessarily the relationship at the individual level. And a lot of young people do well even with high levels of poverty, and even with to some extent limited educational achievement in some senses. One of the problems that we've had is one of the problems that we've seen in this community is there have been such significant problems with education that the difference between the impact of education on crime in some cases is not very clearly understood. In In other words, we compared murder victims, for example, with and suspects in murder cases, people engaged in violence. We compared at one point their educational achievement with a random sample of educational achievement of kids from their neighborhood, and we found that, and this was some of the most disappointing findings we've had. We found that the educational levels and successes were so low across the board that didn't help distinguish between people involved in violence from people not involved in violence. And what that tells me is that the overall successes in education have had a very dramatic impact across the board in neighborhoods. And some people are doing are avoiding involvement in violence in some ways, and they're not being influenced as heavily by that educational experience as others. If you were to look across districts or across the state, you'd find a strong relationship. But when you look at just in poor neighborhoods, just in the neighborhoods that are struggling to address violence, the educational level is so widely problematic that it doesn't help you understand violence very well at all.
And to prove, to point out another issue, this isn't just a problem here in Rochester, as you're saying, when we go into poor communities. So poor communities across the country are basically being faced with this same dilemma.
We have nationally, been very heavily dependent on the use of incarceration in criminal justice. And we're now starting to recognize across the country the impact of that on communities, and the fact that that response to crime itself is having very significant impacts. Now, there are features to Rochester and in the history of Rochester that make its experience a little different than other communities in some ways. For example, the nature of the economy here has been one that we've never had the sort of kind of heavy level manufacturing work that was true in Detroit when they were making automobiles or other places. We had a fairly highly sophisticated process manufacturing of Kodak film and chemical manufacturing, which took pretty high levels of education to begin with. So this community for a very long period of time has been a divided community between people who have done well and are highly educated and doing very well, and a population of people for whom there have been few employment opportunities, and because they haven't had the educational level, or because at one point there were other biases in the way hiring decisions were made with African American minorities, and even before that, Southern and Eastern Europeans who were not being. So this has been a town that has had deep divisions for a long period of time, and those divisions may be run deeper and have been here longer than in many other communities.
Let's talk about some of the initiatives that you're doing out there with the students. For instance, the TIP. Would you tell the listening audience, the viewing audience, what that is and what you're trying to develop and accomplish with that?
Well, we have been involved with working with a number of community organizations around a project that's been called Project TIPS, but it has been an effort to respond to issues that come up in neighborhoods, most often crime-related kinds of issues, that have really attempted to sort of bring people into those neighborhoods, and it's a sort of short-term, immediate kind of response to crisis situations that have been able that have sought to bring people into those neighborhoods, unite to the extent we can, communicate with people in those neighborhoods. A cookout goes on, a survey goes on, in an effort to connect individuals to services, but an effort to really allow communities to come together at a critical moment where there may have been an event, a particular significant crime, for example, that has had people withdraw into their homes and pull further away from community life, we think. And our goal has been to try and work with those communities to the extent we could to try and send the signal, in fact, across that those neighborhoods people are not alone in those neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods are not alone in their efforts to address these kinds of things. And what we we found, I mean, it's been interesting, and we've been working. We've had students working on the survey section of this for a long time, and what we find there is that, you know, we often think of these neighborhoods, and the term crescent gets used, and we put it in the context of crime, we put it in the context of poverty and other things. When you actually talk to people in these neighborhoods about life in those neighborhoods, people, for the most part, are pretty happy. They're probably as happy as anybody in terms of neighborhoods. Everyone's got good feelings about neighborhoods, and everyone's got some concerns about the neighborhoods, where they live. And that's equally true in the neighborhoods that we talk to. People who have lived there for a very long period of time, in many cases, have concerns like anyone would have. But like those neighborhoods, find a history and tradition and neighbors that they like that they're comfortable with and want to sustain. And they want to see those neighborhoods be strong and continue to grow. And they want them to be good neighborhoods to continue to raise their families in. So all these data that we look at, in many ways, it can leave you with a feeling that there are deep troubles, and you may be tempted to sort of throw up your arms and say, what do we do? And then when you actually spend more time and see both in terms of the information that we collect and the experiences that we have and people have in those neighborhoods, there's a lot of great strengths in those neighborhoods. There's a lot of important things that go on, and people who have lived there for a long time, and other people who come in and plan on living there and staying there for a long time, and are really interested in building and working in those neighborhoods. And that really is core, I think. When you ask me what are the things that are important, I think that's a critically important resource, to really draw on those solid, stable resources in those neighborhoods, the people who like them, and feel good about the community they're in, and even people from outside who feel part of a shared experience of living in the greater Rochester area, and a concern for their neighbors in this community.
I think that's a very remarkable statement, especially based on the information that you've given us and the disparity there. But there's still hope inside this community. There's still a sense of community there, and that despite what these reports are saying, and despite what we know to be a harsh reality, a stark reality, there are still people that want to still remain in these communities and try to build them up.
And you got to be very careful. I think it's experience. It's something I've learned along the way, to not get your head stuck in the charts exclusively, and to really understand that while the charts help you understand some situations and raise some concerns, that there is a whole other side where you really have to understand other elements and other dimensions of community life to understand what's going on in those communities at the moment, what issues are relevant in people's minds, and how people feel about the future and how people feel about their lives. Having spent a lot of time on the charts, when we go back and look in the neighborhoods more carefully and closely, we always find that there are real strengths and real reasons, I think, to say that there are resources in these communities that really can help address what are these structural problems that have really come into this community in many ways from a whole variety of sources, but they all have dealt with and come to deal with the neighbors, the people next door, the people who live there for a long time, or the people who have a history in those neighborhoods.
How do we take this information and get, for instance, law enforcement and the people that live in these communities to, for instance, do community policing? How do we change the perception that it's us against them? How do we take this information, reach the good people in this community, get them to start working with law enforcement to perhaps maybe stop a lot of the disputes that are going on there, the selling of drugs that are going on there, the different things that are being committed in those areas? How do we get those people that enjoy living in this community to associate themselves with law enforcement?
You know, I think you're always asking the right questions. It makes me a little uncomfortable. But clearly, that's the issues. And there is a danger with all the statistics that I present to you that we have to be aware of, and that is the danger of seeing these things as sort of an emergency, an immediate emergency that we need to respond to in some sort of crisis kind of mentality. You can have problems when you do that. You can respond in ways, and there are times in the short term where you have to do things.
Just interrupt you. Well, that seems to be the problem with law enforcement, is that they see this data, and so what they do when they come into these neighborhoods, they don't come into this neighborhood like they would on Park Avenue. On Park Avenue, they're there to serve and protect, but over in the Crescent area, they're coming in 4 deep in a car many times, and it is as if they're just waiting for an opportunity to jump out the car, to do something. So how do we get that connect? How do we get the police to start looking that there are good people here, and that this data does not reflect everyone that lives there?
You know, I think that, I think this takes some real understanding across that divide, because when responsible people in law enforcement or responsible people in government see that Rochester's having 50 murders a year and a rate of 25 homicides per year, and that there really is what you can argue is a genocide that has occurred in these neighborhoods, responsible people think we need to do something about this. We need to respond to this, and they look for the resources required to do that and respond in a way to address that immediate sort of crisis. What it takes, I think, is for the community and for government and law enforcement to do that, to respond to the crisis, but at the same time to have a broader vision that is about building community, supporting those strengths in the community, solving problems in the community without thinking that you can just pull things or people out of that community to resolve those kinds of problems. So I'm very optimistic about the community policing potential here and its development and use. I'm very optimistic about what's been happening in the whole criminal justice system, the problem-solving courts, the drug court, the other kinds of courts here that say maybe we have to find other ways to address this set of problems, and maybe we can find ways to do this in which we are conscious of not only the harm of the crime itself, but the potential harm to the way we respond to the crime.
Okay.
And that really takes everybody with a concern for these set of issues to come together to work for a common good on this. I think there's a good foundation for that here.
Also, I wanted to go into a little bit further, as when we were talking about how approximately 1,000 people coming back into the community in these areas. I know that you're working on a re-entry program. As it stands right now, we snatch them out and then we just bring them right back in, rehabilitated or not. They're put right back into the same environment that they left. How do we address bringing these individuals back in so now they can actually become productive citizens? When we talk about public safety, I don't think there's anything safe about bringing people back into public when they are basically still the same people, and because now they're confined to a particular zip code area. Yes, the city of Rochester is fine, but these neighborhoods are always in jeopardy. So how do we bring these people back in so they can be more constructive?
I mean, I think this is an enormous challenge, and it's an enormous challenge, and you're exactly right. This is an enormous challenge faced by the city, but more particularly by neighborhoods and by communities and by streets and by corners. I mean, it gets to that level. And the truth of the matter is this is a very, very difficult task. We relied so heavily on incarceration that now we have very large numbers of people coming back to communities and back to these neighborhoods every year. And the truth is that very little is happening in prison that's going to have a positive effect on those people who are coming back. So people are coming back with few resources, with few opportunities, and people are coming back who, prior to leaving prison, had very few resources and few opportunities. So they're coming back in much the same way, but they're facing a whole new set of problems. I mean, people coming out of prison are wondering where they're going to sleep tonight or tomorrow or next week, and how they're going to get by in the short period of time. So there is a crisis period when people come out where it's now very clear that we need to find ways to support people, to provide opportunities, to find housing, and to find the sort of things that will help people get by in the short term. But we also need to make sure that issues of drug involvement are addressed, and that education and job opportunities are there. And the weight of those fall very disproportionately in communities, and we need to concentrate those resources. Before the real stress of economic problems that has occurred, there was really an awakening going on to this set of problems. That people were really starting to understand that we had sent many people to prison over the years, and now they're all coming back. And there was really a movement that began, in many ways, under the Bush administration, to begin to address these issues. But the difficulty is those are the first set of resources, the first set of funds to get cut and to have problems with as the economy has gone down. So we're back in many ways with an increasing number of people coming out of prison and dwindling resources to address that.
I wanted to address the area of education. Once again, when we see the dynamics that is going on in the Crescent area, in other communities, education has been the tool to get you from one level to another. And across the board, that this has been basically ingrained into the mindset of people. But here in the Crescent, we're seeing that they are impacted by a very unique set of circumstances. So education on one side isn't enough to get these people out. One of the reasons why I'm talking about this is, once again, these children that live in this community are seeing that vast number of people either on parole, probation, or coming out of jail, going to jail. Once again, these kids don't have supervision. There aren't enough people there where they can see where education has actually moved one person to another level. And so how do we begin, once again, to trying to get education to become, or is education in front of this, or do we need to try to somehow resolve some of these issues so education becomes a clear reality?
I think that if I understand your question, I think that all these things are related and come together and have to be addressed together. And I think it's even a broader set of issues than that. There are lots of people who grow up across this entire metropolitan area who, when they in fact make it out of their neighborhoods, out of their communities, understand that the world they grew up in is a whole lot different than the outside world where they're going to go and find a living and find a life. And that when you go into a work world, there's going to be a much more diverse population in that work world. There's going to be a much more diverse group of people you're going to have to interact with and deal with. And that's as true in the suburbs as it is in the Crescent, as we talk about. So I think that it becomes critically important that we understand the importance of education and that we make education relevant to the people who we are trying to bring into that process, and who are trying to make a better life. And I think also that on a broader level, we have to face the facts that the isolation that we see in this community, the economic isolation, the racial isolation, is not in anyone's interest, whether you're out in the suburbs and sitting in a classroom surrounded by all kids who look exactly like you, or whether you're in the city and sitting in a classroom surrounded by kids who look exactly like you. That's not the way the rest of the world is. That's not the way the adult world is when people get out of those communities, and we need to change those sets of experiences too.
So, as we begin to wrap this up and try to bring this to a close, basically what we're going to need are the people in the community that have a good sense of community reaching out to help develop this. We're going to need law enforcement to come in to sit down at the table and help deal with this crisis. We're going to have I guess, our government, our city government, to get involved with this. And what we're going to have to do is to bring in all that it takes to make a community great. I agree with you that we've got to stop looking at these things in isolation and saying that because these problems are situated in this particular neighborhood, therefore we've confined this. So basically we've quarantined the rest of the city off from this sickness, if you will. But now by the same token, the reality is if we have a problem here, it is just a matter of time before it will seep out to other veins into this community, and the other parts of this community will begin to feel this. It was the same thing with drugs. They thought when they introduced drugs into these neighborhoods that would stay there, but it had a way of finding its way outside of that. The same thing with teen pregnancy. When they saw what was going on in these neighborhoods, they thought it would be contained there, but we see that teen pregnancy is way beyond just outside of the Crescent area. So what we're going to basically need is a really concerted effort of this community looking at these problems not as the Crescent area, black problems, white problems, young or old problems, but a Rochester problem.
I think you're exactly right. I think we need to understand community and the interests of the community at large. And we need to understand that you can't even have a healthy economy locally, an economy that works for anyone, if in fact we're not producing people who can work in that economy and contribute to that economy. That you can't isolate these problems and seal them off. I think you said it very well. We really have to recognize our shared interests and our shared fate, and move forward from that foundation.
Okay. Any last minute comments that you want to give us? What can we talk about how we can help at what you're doing at the university? How can we get people to get in touch with this organization and help push some of these initiatives along?
Well, I think that our interest in the work that we're doing is really to contribute to an informed public, a public that has access to information and that can use that information. So we have a web page.
Would you give us a web page?
Sure. We have a web page at www.rit.edu/CPSI for Center for Public Safety Initiatives, in which people can contact us from, and also can get access to all the work that we do, and we post it all up there so that people can understand it. But I do think that the real contribution we can make through that is to help engage the community in this discussion in an informed way, and in a way in which we learn from the experiences in the community, and we try to contribute to the community with our understanding of the data and information that's generated out of this community.
I thank you so much for providing this information to us. I'm hoping that our listening audience has enjoyed this wealth of information that you brought to us. and let's begin to start making this community better. Thank you so much.
Thank you, James.
Okay.
Pleasure to see you.
Thank you. I'd like to share with you a story. There was a gentleman who used to enjoy going for a ride in his automobile. He would put the top down and he would reserve Sundays for this particular enjoyment for himself. He would take his car and ride out into the country because there they had these winding, curving roads, and it just exhilarated him to be driving out there by himself, feeling peaceful with the world. This one particular Sunday, as he was driving through the countryside, a woman came speeding by him, and it startled him. And he almost drove off the road. And as she drove by, she yelled at him, "Pig!" As he began to regain control of his car and not to be outdone, he yelled back at her, "Cow!" And when he went around the curve, he hit the pig. Many times what seems to be an insult, many times what we think that appears to be that we're making a criticism could be a warning. And that's what I would like to leave the viewing audience. The show that you saw tonight is a warning. It is something that we need to be aware of. It is something that we need to make this city better. We call this city Greater Rochester, so that must mean that we must be Greater Rochesterians. I ask you, what kind of legacy will we leave behind if we have a community that is isolated, that is not receiving the economic benefit, the economic growth, the cultural growth, the continuity of growth that we see in other sections of Rochester? This is not just a problem that impacts the Crescent area. This is a problem that is impacting and will impact the entire city of Rochester. I ask you again, what kind of legacy do we want to leave behind? Do we want to leave a legacy of we are a city that had great problems? Or do we want to leave the legacy that we became great because we found ways to solve our problems? In order to see another day, you first have to make it through the night. And should you make it through the night, guess what? When you wake up, it's a new day. My name is James Young. I look forward to seeing you next week. Be blessed.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
And I say it again, you've been had, you've been took, you've been hoodwinked, bamboozled, led astray.